Welcome to the Tech Humanist Show, a multimedia format program exploring how data and technology shape the human experience. I'm your host, Kate O'Neill. Please subscribe or follow wherever you're watching or listening to this so that you won't miss any new episodes, because we have a lot of great guests coming up. And today's guest is no exception. Today, we are talking with Calli Schroeder, an attorney in privacy and data security. She's a privacy advocate and self-described diehard nerd. I think many of us can relate to that. I love this part. Her brief stint as a wedding singer led her to wonder if she had violated copyright law, an interest which transitioned into tech law broadly and privacy law specifically. While in law school, Schroeder interned for FTC Commissioner Julie Brill, published an article on consent issues and IRBs in the Colorado Technology Law Journal, among other accomplishments and distinctions. She developed a focus on consumer protection issues, surveillance, data breaches, and freaking people out at parties. Among the certifications she holds are privacy designations for the US, Europe, and Canada. She's originally from Whitefish, Montana, and Calli holds an undergraduate degree in peace studies from Whitworth University. Outside of work, she enjoys traveling, music, and extensive debates about comic books. I've been so looking forward to this, so please help me welcome. I think maybe that might have fixed it. Someone please. Oh, here we go. Michael Rockwell, Kate O'Neill, we lost your audio. We can hear Calli, but not you. Thank you. I am having such a tough time with the audio for this show. I don't know why. I definitely need to look into that. But let me just go through and make sure that everybody knows that we're talking to Calli Schroeder, and she's an attorney who focuses in data and privacy issues. All right, Michael Rockwell confirms I'm back now. Thank you, Michael. So back to talking about the copyright law around the wedding singing, but that so that leads you into tech law broadly. So it's like you're interested in the copyright application, but how does that then translate into becoming interested in tech law and privacy?
It was an interesting shift. I started taking copyright and IP classes in law school just because I thought that was interesting given my background. And part of what got me into tech more broadly and into privacy specifically was I really loved the professor I had for copyright law, so I just started taking more and more of his classes. His name is Paul Ohm. He now heads up tech law and policy division over at Georgetown.
Shout out to Paul Ohm. All right.
He's great. But because he's got a programming background, he taught some really fascinating classes. So we had a Jan term class on technology law and coding for lawyers, privacy for lawyers. He taught a computer crimes class. And
that sounds really fascinating.
Oh, it was so cool. I loved that class. I read a lot about Snowden for a stretch. And through that, I broadly got more and more interested in privacy, more and more interested in surveillance tech. I joined and later worked for the Colorado Technology Law Journal, and that led to me getting more and more into these tech issues. So it kind of came about by accident. I've never been a particularly techie person. I'm a privacy and tech lawyer who will openly admit, because I know it's a huge mistake to pretend you know more than you do. I don't know how to code. I'm trying to teach myself, and I'm very slow because I'm not good about setting aside practice time. But I just find the area so fascinating, and now I'm deep in the weeds of it.
Yeah, increasingly so, right? Like, so you have certifications in privacy as a what does the CIPP stand for? Remind us.
It's the Certified Information Professional.
Okay.
I believe.
And you have
privacy
that
professional.
Information privacy professional. Say that a few times fast, I guess.
Right.
So you have that designation applying to, is it Canada, the US, and Europe? Are those three?
Canada, US, Europe, and now I have the CIPM, which is the privacy management, and the FIP, which is the Fellow of Information Privacy. Full disclosure, part of why I have so many certifications is because I worked for the IAPP after law school, and while I was working there, I could take the tests for free when they offered them. So
that's great.
That's part of why I just took a test every single time they offered the chance to.
That's smart. I remember I used to work at a language school, and one of the perks we had was that we got to take free language tests. So
Oh,
I just kept racking up all kinds of language classes
oh, that's
and
amazing.
certifications. So, but as you've gotten deeper into that, and you have all these certifications, and you are working in the space, it's become a more interesting space. I mean, every year it seems like it becomes a more interesting space. So you've
Oh,
got,
I fully agree.
GDPR hitting the scene in, what was it, 2018, right?
Yep, yeah. My big projects when I was at the IAPP, the GDPR had been passed and was going to go into effect shortly, and so we were doing a lot of redrafting the EU documentation and trying to put out guidance and really interpret how that was going to be applied. So I was doing all of the prep work at the IAPP and then jumped to a firm afterwards where I was doing more of the practical client guidance on how to be compliant before the effective date hit.
Oh,
So
okay, okay. I was
I've
going
been
to
on
ask you
both
to sort of walk us
sides.
through what that type of work looked like. But I think so many of us received emails notifying us that it was coming that we probably have a sense of what that looked like. Well, what
It's
was
true.
that like boots on the ground? Was that what that was? Is a lot of guidance and hand holding about like who you're going to have to notify and by when and stuff like that, or was it uh,
It
trickier
was. It
than
was
that?
a lot of working directly with clients that way. And a lot of it was really building out an internal privacy program for clients that, for a lot of US based clients, it's not that they were purposely negligent when it came to data protection or data mapping practices. They just had never had any real regulatory motivation to pay attention to that. And so it always fell by the
Right.
wayside when it came to allocating resources. So we were building a lot of programs from the bottom up. We were doing data mapping for the first time in companies. You know, they were figuring out exactly where all the information that they collected went and what they collected and why they used it and what legal bases we could use to justify that or
Right.
whether they needed to start deleting stuff. And um, it was interesting. You get a really good idea of kind of the inner workings of companies and start to develop a lot of strategies for figuring out what questions to ask and when you need to push a little deeper on things. Nobody likes to admit that they may not know exactly where everything goes within their company, but particularly for large companies or companies that collect a lot of data, it's extremely common. So,
Yeah, I would imagine. And then of course we have the California Privacy Act that came online what, January this year? Is that
mhm.
right?
Yep.
So was it again sort of a repeat of GDPR?
That was interesting. We had a really big split with the CCPA. For GDPR, I feel like it kind of put the fear of God in a lot of US companies. So everyone was scrambling for compliance. We had a huge influx of people asking to help them with compliance before the due date hit. With CCPA, I saw a real divergence in approach. There were a lot of companies that were very responsible and came to us wanting us to help them be compliant with the CCPA right as the enforcement date hit, so they were ready to go. And then not necessarily my clients, but I did see in quite a lot of instances there seemed to be more companies that were willing to gamble when it came to compliance that
Hmm.
way. I don't know if that's because they thought the attorney general wouldn't be able to enforce en masse, or
Huh.
whether they thought that their privacy practices were maybe not fully compliant, but probably good enough to skate by for a while and kind of wanted to get the lay of the land before figuring out resources. But it was surprising seeing that split from the GDPR. And now with the CPRA on the ballot, it'll be even more interesting because if that passes, it will definitely raise the amount of enforcement actions.
Yeah, and so do you feel like did you observe anecdotally that it changed the discourse at all when the GDPR suits started happening and that the enforcement was happening and Google and other companies were actually receiving fines? So was that changing the way companies were taking it seriously?
From what I've seen, yes. And in particular, one of the things I noticed is that clients, even of smaller mid-level companies that maybe hadn't paid much attention to privacy or data security before, were paying attention to these lawsuits. They were coming to us saying, "Hey, I just read about this. Should I be worried? Do I need to change things? What should I be looking at?" I mean, for example, we just had the Schrems 2 case happen. I had a bunch of clients reach out to me proactively before we had issued our statement on it, saying, "This seems like it changes things. What do we need to do? How
Yeah.
should we take care of this?" And frankly, it was pretty refreshing to see that so many of our clients were now actively paying attention to this on their own as an issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I guess, one thing I'm really curious about to talk about with you, and I want to spill that you told me via email as we were prepping for the show. You said that you have minors in both philosophy and theology in your undergrad, and so you occasionally get a little into privacy affecting the nature of society and humanity. And you said, but I will try to reel it in. And I'm like, no, don't reel that in. That's exactly what we want to bring to the show. So I guess, one question I have for you on that, in that more esoteric kind of philosophical bent is, do you think that the way we conceive of privacy has changed or is changing or is due to change? Is like, where do you think what externalities do you think kind of come into the way that humans conceive of privacy, and what's going to happen over the next few years, over the next few milestones? What do you see those as being?
Yeah.
Not a small question, I understand.
Not a small question, but an important one. To preface, I'm a little split in my professional and personal approaches to privacy. So obviously, personally, I'm very, very privacy protective, and I'm very loud about that online. And personally, I believe myself to maintain those values, but I need to channel them in practical ways that clients can actually use. Like there's the idealistic form of privacy that I think I have in my personal life. And then there's also the practical form of, well, okay, but this company is not going to just stop collecting data.
Right.
And
sure.
So how can I guide them in a way that makes them do it as responsibly as possibly and as ethically and transparently as possible,
right,
while meeting regulatory requirements? So this, I'm going to go full into my personal answer on privacy perspectives. But so I do believe that our approach toward privacy has been fundamentally changing. I believe that for many years it's been changing in the direction where people haven't been paying attention to it and have lost a good amount of the kind of privacy that we were used to. And part of that comes from the development of technology. We have so much more prevalent technology that's really permeated every area of life. You have, there's smart fridges on the market.
Right.
It was really hard for me to find non-connected kitchen devices when I was redoing my house.
We just bought an air conditioner, an in-window air conditioner for our apartment, and it was so hard to pick one that didn't have, smart features built in. I'm like, I don't want that. I don't want a smart air conditioner.
Yeah, I had to get a new television, and oh my gosh, it was such a nightmare trying to find one that wasn't a smart TV and wasn't connected somehow, and it's so hard.
Good luck next time you have to buy a toilet. I mean,
I know. It's ridiculous all over the place. But yeah, because of all of those changes and because it's so interwoven with just aspects of our daily life, I feel like there's been this gradual shift in that, where before you got to be a lot more deliberate about what aspects of who you are and what pieces of information about you shared with different people in different settings. Now it's just ingrained. And so the choice is gone in a lot of ways. But I'll also say that I've seen a much more positive trend in privacy, in that there's been a lot more pushback in at least recent years. So some of it's regulatory. The GDPR is a great prompt for considering privacy concerns. The US is very sectoral in its privacy approach, but there's been individual state laws that are incredible. Like the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act is great and having some really cool enforcement. CCPA is prompting some really great conversations around what information we protect and how we protect it and what level of control we have and whether that should be left to people. On a societal level, the interesting thing for me is seeing younger generations and what their approach is to privacy and to being watched.
Yeah.
And, I'm millennial, so I grew up in a little bit of the cusp. When I was very young, we had a computer in my house when I was probably 10 or 11, but they were so old and you didn't use them all that often for a long stretch. You used them for, Word documents, but you didn't necessarily use them for internet all that often. And we really didn't have smartphones in the way that we do now. And living through all those changes and seeing how gradually that happens and how suddenly every aspect of your life is watched is really interesting to me, particularly seeing this current generation that is growing up with all of that just already existing, already in place, But one thing that I find so interesting is the ways that they find to push back against that. there's a lot of really creative loopholes and workarounds and kind of hacks of tech that younger generations are using. So even though they've been put into this world where they're always watched, they're actively fighting for privacy and for space to kind of figure out who they are without eyes on them all the time. And I just think that's really valuable.
It's such an interesting dichotomy because it is a more connected generation in many ways, and I think they are inherently that the younger you skew. I know that there are some differences generationally where some actually prefer less online time, but I think in general, like I'm Gen X, so the younger you skew in general away from my generation and above, you see a lot more native sort of familiarity with being online. But yes, you're right. I mean, then those attitudes also change. Like there isn't an inherent acceptance of the trade-off of that I'm going to give up so much of my self and what quantifies who I am so that you can then sell to me more effectively.
Yep.
Well, it's interesting. I agree with. I think I'm probably very aligned with your distinction on the personal and professional level. The professional level is a really interesting one, though, because I think you do have to have this kind of pragmatic. It's not defeatism, I don't think, but it's a pragmatic view that that companies are going to collect data and they are going to use it in aggregate and in segments to be able to better understand targeting offers or better understand, even just to improve user experiences, inherent to the pages and sites that they serve up. So how do you take over from the personal approach and carry it over into the professional? Like where do you go with that?
Well, one thing is that I'm really grateful that my super privacy protective perspective from my personal life can carry over in a ethical and responsible way where I'm still advising my clients well when I'm telling them to, practice data minimization and, make sure that they're only collecting the information they need and that they're putting in really good security protocols and that they're very clear and transparent about what they're doing and honest with their users. I like to push really hard for the companies to understand what's going on with their data, because a lot of companies use vendors that are just common. You use Google Analytics or you use different storage vendors and share information with, people that are using behavioral advertising algorithms and things like that. And so being able to advise them and have discussions with them where I'm saying, I really think you should evaluate what this costs you an effort in disclosing all of this and making sure you're doing it correctly versus what you're getting from it. I've had some really interesting discussions with clients about the value of behavioral advertising and that I don't think there's much value in it.
And not to mention protecting it against breaches and leaks. So, the risk.
Yeah, the more information you have, the more risk you have of a breach and the more liability you have. Mm-hmm. If you have a data breach and all you've collected about your clients is name and mailing address for the services, that's hugely different than if you've also collected their, race and gender and income and financial account information and sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. And people collect so much nowadays just because they can, because the technology is capable of that. And until you push back a little bit and challenge them and say, okay, but why that? Why do you need that? Why do you want that? And really highlight for them that they're raising their own risk. That's something that helps me kind of justify to myself the work I do, because I can see, and I know that there are some privacy really, really purists that would argue that me working with clients that collect data is unethical. And while I can understand the motivation behind that argument, I find a lot more value in engaging and making the world more privacy protective by talking to companies that are engaged with it and trying to make them do it in a responsible way than I do in just pulling myself out entirely and not engaging. Yeah. And beyond that, like I can advise my clients, and I do advise my clients, and I want to do right by them and do right by the people whose information they're collecting. But you also can do other things. I mean, I also read a bunch of policy proposals and send in formal comments on privacy laws that are being proposed or different approaches to cases, or, we discuss this all the time with the different privacy community. The privacy to be very active in debates and discussions about regulations and cases and proposals, and you can still be engaged in all of that and push for kind of regulatory and social change while also doing the practical work of telling a client, in this circumstance that you're doing right now, here's how we make this safer.
Yeah, and I think, in my own consulting, in my own work, I find that conversation about the increasing risk when you're talking about more and more data is a really useful one to have at the sort of C-suite level. But also, it seems like even just at a strategy level, saying that, you shouldn't collect data if you can't think of an aligned reason why you would want to have it, right? Like aligned between what benefits you and what benefits the customer or the person outside the company. Like if it's only benefiting you and it's not going to benefit them in any way ever, then there's probably really good reason not to even bother collecting it.
Completely agree. And also the whole mentality where collected just so you have it just in case, that's such an irresponsible perspective. both from a general privacy perspective and for them. Why would you want piles more information than you're even using? It just increases your risk.
Right. We have a question from one of our followers here, one of the audience members, David Ryan Polgar, who I love. So should social media platforms offer data portability to move valuable data across different platforms? What do you think about that?
I think more and more as social media has changed in what it does in different contexts, I think absolutely. I do think partly, let me clarify that, partly because people use different social media as tools, both professionally and creatively now, as well as to connect with other people and for networking and for other services. So, artists and photographers constantly share their artwork through social media, and writers practice their craft through social media, and people that are in professional spheres, like I'm not necessarily recommending this because I'm sure they get annoying sometimes, but I constantly write long Twitter threads kind of analyzing privacy issues or legal issues that I see because I want people to engage with it more. So I absolutely see the value in data portability and in making sure that you can preserve those things should you leave a platform for whatever reason. I don't know how useful it always is. I think it's very useful in that you get a copy of everything that you've put there. I don't know how portable it is because I don't know, like if I took all of my information from Twitter tomorrow, I don't know that I could actually transfer that to another social media platform because I don't think they're compatible in a lot of ways. So I think there are absolutely uses to data portability. I think there's absolutely value to it. And I think there's value to forcing the company to go through the exercise of saying, we know where all of your information is and we've organized this internally.
Sure.
And, just to make sure that internally they're practicing good data structuring and are able to track all of that. But yeah, I don't know about actually transferring it to other platforms. That's kind of an interesting question.
Right. It is an interesting question.
I'm going to keep thinking about that.
I also am wondering what you think about the own your own data sort of movement. Where do you stand on that concept of, the notion that eventually at some point we may be able to move to a model where people are in control of their own data and they can be paid for it and that sort of thing. Where are you on that?
So I understand the appeal of it. I absolutely understand that it can be a kind of easier way to wrap your mind around how data works, to think of it as a piece of property that you own. I absolutely get the appeal of it. I think that there's some very thoughtful people that support that view. I don't. But the reasons that I don't are, first of all, I think that puts way too much responsibility on the individual. We don't even know how much information gets collected and by whom half the time. So having to track that or parcel out portions of your data for different uses, I think just puts too much of it puts too much of a time responsibility on people, certainly. I mean, that's a hugely time-consuming process, but it also puts a lot of research responsibility on people. Like, I work in privacy, so I do a lot of research into the trade-offs of sharing information just for my work, which is great. But other people have full-time jobs in other areas and are taking care of small children and are dealing with family members and have lives to live. They don't necessarily have time to sit down and do all of that. The other issue I have is it sets up an inequality when it comes to being paid for your information. Who's going to have the most incentive to share their information, even if they wouldn't normally? if they're getting paid. It's going to be people with lower incomes. Right. And so that sets up a system where the wealthy can kind of afford to keep their information private, and the less wealthy have a lot more incentive to say, I don't love this, but I need to pay rent. So here, pay me for this, I guess. So I don't like that split either. And then the other concern I have with it is I don't know how much bargaining power you would have with big companies. Even if you're the owner of your information, big companies are still big companies, and they have a lot of power. And depending on what they're offering, you may not actually get that much for your information. You may not get a ton of money or value for it because, if you don't want to sell it, there's 100,000 other people that are willing to, and they'll do it at X price. So I just think there are a lot of complications with that approach that don't necessarily benefit people in the way it's intended to benefit people.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful, thorough, well thought out answer. And I think another aspect of the point, the last point you were just making, is that I've seen the number somewhere that suggests that individually your Facebook data, for example, would be worth like 20 cents or 40 cents or something like that, right? Compared to, in the aggregate, what Facebook is going to get in terms of monetizing it through the advertising platform.
Yeah.
And being able to offer the hyper targeting that it does. So I mean, there's absolutely very little incentive to educate yourself and spend the time and become a merchant of your own data when it means pennies.
Yep.
As opposed
and frankly, just on a personal level, I don't like working in sales, so I don't want to do it in my free time.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting. And by the way, David, who asked us the question about the portability, says, great answer and loving the show. So, yes. Yeah. And also another point here from Kyle Johnson is also the connections you have on a social network aren't portable to another. So, and I can even say, for me, the sort of model that I use, mental model that I use for who I connect with on Twitter versus Facebook versus LinkedIn, very, very different, kind of construct,
absolutely.
Right? I'm sure that's true for most people. And so certainly it would seem very meaningless unless you were moving from a Twitter-like platform to another Twitter-like platform, that you might be able to maintain some of the integrity of those connections, but most likely not. So that's a good point. Well, what about, how do you think about the emerging concerns around privacy? I mean, certainly we have a lot more surveillance technology coming into being. We have, facial recognition is an enormous topic within this space. Where do you sort of find yourself most concerned about privacy issues in emerging tech?
I mean, you've mentioned facial recognition. I am hugely concerned with facial recognition, partly because it feels, I really hope it doesn't prove to be, but it feels very much like one of those technologies where, once it's out, you can't put it back in this doesn't exist, don't use this category. I hope that we're still early enough in the use of facial recognition that there could be steps to restrict it and to put more responsible use cases around it. I frankly just really don't like it as a technology, partly because of, there's been tons of much more informed people than me talking about the issues when it comes to identifying darker skin tones or accuracy with non-binary or trans individuals, which is a huge issue because, in a lot of places, including the US, there's higher likelihood that those communities get targeted under these systems anyway. And if those same communities that are being targeted also have a really high instance of inaccuracy in identification, it really facilitates the opportunity for abuse of those systems. So I hate that. Sure. And even beyond that, even if facial recognition worked perfectly and identified people correctly every time, I still wouldn't think we should use it because it really does change something about the nature of being tracked everywhere you go. It changes something about your freedom to move around a public space and to restrict your information and your whereabouts and that sort of thing. And the counterpoint I hear to that all the time is, well, why would that bother you if you're not doing anything bad? But the I don't have anything to hide argument has never held water. I mean, this is gross.
In case there are people watching or listening who don't know why that argument doesn't hold water, would you take a moment to say why you think that I mean, I certainly feel like it doesn't hold water, but
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you give if you have a concise explanation as to why the notion, if you have nothing to hide, that there's no reason for privacy. Why is that wrong?
Well, oh, it's wrong for so many reasons. But so the best example I've heard is a little gross, and I'm so sorry. But basically, there's a big difference between privacy and secrecy. Secrecy is more about concealing something you just don't want anyone to know about because it's nefarious or perceived badly or whatever. Privacy just means that you want to conceal it because you don't feel like sharing it. So, for example, if I'm hanging out at my friend's house and I get up to go to the bathroom there, I close the door and people know what I'm doing in there. It's not secret what's probably going on in the bathroom, but I close the door because I want privacy. That's gross. But beyond that, there's privacy issues when it comes to, sometimes you may be just wanting to feel out something and not like kids trying to figure out what their political views are. Sometimes you want to be able to explore that, or their sexual orientation. You want to be able to explore that in a safe and secure way without having to come out with a hard stance or making a decision or having people observing you, because there's also been multiple studies that just the act of being observed and knowing you're being observed changes behavior and changes thinking and doesn't allow people to freely express themselves or explore ideas. And it's a really stifling situation. So a good portion of why I oppose that is the stifling aspect of it. But yeah, when it comes down to the I've got nothing to hide argument, that also changes hugely based on context. I mean, communities like refugees are surveilled hugely. After 9/11, Muslim communities were surveilled on an incredible scale, and communities of color and people with different sexual orientations or gender presentations are often surveilled much more. And they may well want more privacy. And it's not because they're doing anything wrong. It's because there are elements of the society around them that will punish them for the not wrong things that they're doing and that they're observed doing. And so the social context around that is also hugely important. Just because you don't think what you're doing is wrong doesn't mean that the society around you won't react badly to it. And you should be able to exercise your rights that way without constant surveillance. So I
think that's a wonderful answer. Yeah, I mean, it seems like you almost could just say, well, it shows a tremendous amount of privilege to be able to make the statement that if you have nothing to hide. But you gave really crisp and clear examples of that, so I think that's very helpful. So, but especially when you were talking about facial recognition and other biometric technology, I think what the big concern there is, those are things you just can't change. So it's one thing to be able to change your email address. I can't
get a new face.
Right.
like if that gets compromised somehow, it's going to cost me a lot of surgery to get a new face. And I like this one, so I don't want to. And I can't change my DNA. I can't change my fingerprints. These are so immutable. If it comes to an account being breached, I can change my password and I can change my username if I need to, but these things are so much more immutable and they're so much more set and they're so much more tied to our actual identities and who we consider ourselves to be that I think the level of sensitivity around them is just so much higher. And so the level of care should be equally as high. And one of the big problems with facial recognition is that the technology has developed so quickly that there really aren't any regulations in place around it. So they've been able to come up in this vacuum of accountability, essentially. And I'm not saying that there's never, ever a circumstance where facial recognition could be useful or could be used for good purposes. I don't know enough to say that definitively. But for sure, we're not in an environment where there's checks on that yet. And that's what really scares me.
There's always at least one example that someone's willing to come up with. And I when I had the super viral tweet around the 10-year challenge last year and was making the rounds of the news programs, I was using the example of the case study of facial recognition having been used in India to track down missing kids. But of course, we know there was a very limited experiment. We don't really know how successful it truly was. How successful it was with facial recognition and would not have been otherwise. When there's no kind of control variable. Yeah. And the harms greatly exceed the benefits in this, and I don't think that's even a controversial statement. So, it is interesting to see that some cities have had some luck with banning facial recognition. and as you mentioned, the Illinois biometric regulation. So do you foresee a lot more sort of city by city, state by state kind of things coming into play that way within the U.S.?
I do. I know that there's a big debate raging about whether there's going to be a federal privacy law in the next year or 2 years or whatever. I don't know what's going to happen there. Frankly, I don't know that the federal government's going to get itself together enough to pass anything substantial. But regardless,
we had a few things on our hands right now.
Right? Yeah, there's some other stuff going on. Regardless, we've had a sectoral system for a long time when it comes to privacy. And so I've been really encouraged by the actions I've seen statewide and the attention I've seen statewide to these issues. I would love for more states to adopt something like BIPA and start enforcing against biometric privacy violations. I like what's happening with CCPA in general because it moves the conversation forward and it moves thought about what rights people have to their information and then what companies are required to do if they want to use that information. I think that there will probably be more sectoral and statewide regulations when it comes to facial recognition. You know, Seattle's got that in place. I know Colorado's been looking into that. But I wish it would move a little quicker.
What makes you optimistic about what you see happening around data privacy law? Is there anything that you kind of look at and think that's what needs to happen, and I'm glad to see it happen, and maybe you want to encourage it to go faster, but where are you most optimistic around it?
You know, one thing that's made me really optimistic is just the level of engagement by people that don't work in this space. I think that's surprising to a lot of people because I feel like privacy can seem like an intimidating space because it can seem very techy and it can seem very, I don't know how to code or I don't know how to program, so I probably won't understand this. Or, it can be very easy to fall into kind of a nihilist approach to privacy and say, well, I can't control everything, so why bother? But I've seen a lot of engagement with people when it comes to privacy rights and when it comes to, hey, what should I be asking for and what should I be fighting for and what should I be looking for? And that has been really encouraging. Just on kind of a ground level, people seem to care more about this. When it comes to regulatory actions, I do love that there's been multiple proposals for a federal privacy law in the U.S. I don't necessarily love all the drafts, but I love that there's that discussion happening and there's some action there. There's a little momentum. I think the GDPR was a great step, and I am happy that it's had the kind of impact it's had, even if it was inconvenient for people at the jump, because it does prompt just much more care and much more thought in what people are doing with personal information. All of those I've found really encouraging. And I think the privacy space can feel kind of like a very David and Goliath struggle where it's big companies and big government surveillance structures that are constantly pushing against privacy. And, we're just these individual attorneys or individual programmers or individual people that are bothered by the structure or the system. But the fact that we've seen these regulations passed and the fact that there's been outcry against things like mass facial recognition use or mass surveillance or companies taking as much data as they're taking, I think that's a good sign. And that's really encouraging for me personally.
That's great. And I think, it seems like I can relate to the idea that people seem to struggle with finding privacy a topic that they can get into because it seems at once abstract and arcane. And like you would have to know a lot of really specific things, but you have to care about these very philosophical ideas at the same time. And it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to reconcile. So I think it's a wonderful thing that folks like you are focused on that. And speaking of folks like you, one of my besties, Tara Aaron Steluto, has commented and said, not sure if this is the right place to ask a question, but I'd love to hear what Calli has to say about the big EU Court of Justice opinion last week and what she's advising clients about how to go forward. So it seems like that sort of fits in with both the conversations we were having about, the professional approach in terms of guiding companies and what you recommend they do, but also thinking about regulations and such. So what do you have to say to Tara's question?
Oh, so much has gone on since the return of Schrems. I referred to it as the restremining in a professional talk, and I feel like that probably shouldn't stick. But beyond just a lot of urgent client response to different things, we've had some practical guidance that we've issued. I personally have been rereading FISA and the EO 12333 and different surveillance acts and all of that. Practically speaking, we've been redoing privacy policies that list Privacy Shield as the sole data transfer method, and we've been putting SECs in place or making sure that they are in place and they're enforceable. And then we've been doing some additional work. I advise clients to put some documentation in place where they can really track, this is the analysis we've done of the risks to the data subjects we collect information on, and this is what we think when it comes to whether we're included under FISA scope and what the likelihood is that our information is tracked. And these are the agreements we put in place with vendors. And, we make sure we encrypt information in these ways. I think having a paper trail is extremely important right now, just to show due diligence and that you've been paying attention to the issues. I wish I'm too lawyerly to say this is for sure what you need to do, and then you're fine. There's always an it depends in there, but I do think that showing clear effort is going to be appreciated, and making sure you're still adhering to the principles that were enshrined under Privacy Shield is going to be very important. I really hope they put out another framework soon, or they put out some guidance soon, because right now I feel like all of us are doing our best to responsibly guide our clients through things, but it's still a very influx, unsettled area. So being as responsible as possible, making sure we're doing as much as we can is kind of what we're doing.
I hear a dog.
She really wants to go outside. I think there's a squirrel.
Oh, well.
Give me 2 seconds.
Sure.
Sorry. All right.
And I know we had, I'm going to go ahead and cue something up here, because we had, before the show started, we actually had a question that was submitted from someone on Twitter. And I'll see if I can get this added up on here real quick. Oh, you can barely see it. Let me make this bigger. Like that. And let's see if you can see it. Got a hi puppy from Bruce Celery. So the dog is already a hit. I don't know about us, but the dog is a hit.
I'll tell Lucy. She'll be very proud. Layla's out there fighting with her now. It'll be great.
That's great. So Shay Swager asked, I'd love to hear more about what meaningful consent looks like with data privacy. I wonder if there's anything we can borrow from sex ed about consent being affirmative, revocable, or centering care or agency. What do you have to say about, where we see, if there are parallels that we can pull from, the conversation about consent in terms of our sexual relationships over into data privacy?
I actually think that's a really interesting way to frame it. I think there's absolutely some really valuable things we can take from what we consider to be correct sexual consent to, consent around data. I think the revocable part is important. I think it's important that it be clear. Transparency is always clear. Make sure that everyone engaged in the conversation knows exactly what they're discussing. And the other part that I think is actually very important is consent to various steps of the process. So if I'm consenting to let a business use my information so I can get their services, that doesn't mean I'm okay with them sharing it with a bunch of other people. Mm-hmm. Just like if I, agree to go on a date, it doesn't mean that you're coming back to my place later. So
right.
There's a lot of steps in between, and there's a lot of different uses of information that should be considered. So full consent, I think, is also really important when it comes to data security and privacy, and making sure that there's the ability to consent to maybe some uses of information, but not all uses of information. I think that's a really important aspect that can get overlooked sometimes. The other,
and how the information is used, right? Like
exactly.
It was an example that I had written in. I shared with Shay and with you, I think, on Twitter, that I had written a piece a few years ago that was talking about Foursquare knowing that I was at a bar that I never searched for on Foursquare or on Google or in any way, shape, or form. I didn't even know the name of the bar because I was going with a friend. We were going after an event and we walked over to this bar. He knew it. And then in the morning, I got an email from Foursquare saying, "What did you think of name of bar?" And it was just like, what? Until this moment, I didn't even know what the bar was called. And
Every
it
part
just
of me
seemed
hates that.
so, yeah, it seemed so creepy and invasive to me. And what it made me think about was that, rape culture is so much about the where accountability and power resides, and the fact that these companies like Foursquare and others that are tracking your location, even if you've said I don't want you tracking it unless I've given you the incentive or the ask right then and there, like unless I've said I want you tracking this, I want to know where I am or where I'm going or whatever, and they're tracking it in the background, at least have the common courtesy not to tell me that you've tracked it. And so I just think it's a whole disconnect around the way that I think the value that the companies that are collecting this data think that they're offering versus what people on the other side of the interaction believe the value to be, and then the assertion of power and dominance in ways that are really weird and wrong. And so I think it's a really important point that Shay has brought up here.
I agree. And I think there's actually some broader parallels you can draw from that to privacy in general. Like, just because I consent for one company to use certain information about me in one way doesn't mean that I consent to all companies that do that service to do the same thing.
Right.
It's specific. It's to this one company that I'm purposely interacting with. It doesn't mean that I'm okay with it in all other contexts. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that I'm always okay with that company using my information over and over. It can, like, if I go on a date with one person, that doesn't guarantee that I will go on a date with them forever anytime they feel like it. It means that you have to keep checking.
Yeah.
And so I think the responsibility to follow up and to be clear on exactly what is being permitted is a carryover. Absolutely.
So a follow-up question from Jenna Jordan in the comments is data ownership a necessary precondition to true, fully empowered consent, though?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if it's owners. The thing that bothers me, I already gave a list of things. One of the things that bothers me a little bit about thinking of data as a physical, tangible good that we own is that just doesn't track with the nature of it. It's kind of a renewable resource that way. It's not like this one thing that I give this one time. It's this constantly regenerating resource. There's always more information about me. And if I share it with one person, that doesn't preclude me from sharing it with other people. And there's different limitations on it than there would be on like a physical object. And in addition, the ownership factor, I think, puts different parameters and responsibilities on the parties involved that I don't necessarily think perfectly correlate. I absolutely get why we constantly use it as, data as property, because that's just a much easier way to understand it. The difficult thing about information, and part of, frankly, why privacy law is constantly fluctuating and is such a kind of squishy area of law in some ways, is that it just doesn't perfectly map onto property law. It intersects constantly, but it doesn't perfectly map. And it doesn't perfectly map onto issues of, contract law and liability and all of that. It touches all these different areas, but it doesn't perfectly form into anything. To the core
we don't
question,
have very good metaphors for data. I mean,
exactly.
We've been talking for too many years about data is the new oil, and there are these kind of concepts of data lakes and that sort of thing, but there's not, those metaphors only go so far and they only make so much sense. And I think data as property that you can own and you can barter and you can commodify, I think, as we can pretty clearly see when you start to model it out, only really works when you're talking about in the aggregate as it's monetized by a corporation like Facebook, as opposed to by an individual in their own interest.
I agree. I do think, to the core question, thinking of it as like, if someone's getting consent from me for my information, that implies I own the information. I think that's accurate. It's not ownership in the same way as you would own a physical good. Like it is mine. It comes from me. It's about me. but it's not the same as saying like my house or my dogs or whatever. So I don't think that assertion is wrong at all. I think that's correct. Like, for consent to work, you have to go from the base assumption that it's because it's of me and connected to me, I'm the one that gets to say whether you use it or not. But it doesn't perfectly correlate when it comes to things like sale or ownership in the traditional sense that way.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
No, I think it's an important thing that, this is why we don't have very good metaphors for this, because I think there aren't enough discussions that are happening across, disciplines and considerations. So I think it's really healthy to keep talking about it so that we can find out what the nuances are and dive into them. So I know we're getting kind of close to our hour here, so I want to make sure that we get to the chance to what I think is a really important question, is that in my work around this tech humanist concept, I'm always trying to think about how we build the best futures for the most people. And I wonder what you think we can do around data privacy law in culture to stand a better chance of bringing about the best futures.
I think education and empowerment are both really important. So keeping the discussion about privacy as a prominent thing and continually bringing it up and kind of keeping it at the forefront of people's minds. The other tricky thing about privacy is that it's something that's never really done. I mean, you don't finally figure it out and like check a box or send in a form and then you're done with privacy and you don't have to deal with it anymore. It's an ongoing thing. Right. It's kind of like, this is also a sad metaphor because of quarantine, but it's kind of like fitness, If I want to stay on top of it, I have to keep doing it. I don't get to just hit a set point where I'm like, awesome, done, never have to go to the gym again. Like, you have to maintain. And that's particularly true of privacy because it involves tech that's constantly evolving and constantly changing and regulations that are constantly evolving and changing. I think to make...
And I'm going to interject and just say, I think it's a challenge to us individually, too, because we're constantly being bombarded with opportunities to participate in things and share things and divulge things about ourselves and make different trade-offs and compromises that we have to evaluate on the fly. And most people don't have the big picture to be able to make that decision in as sophisticated a way as they need to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think for a bigger picture, trying to make the future better for people when it comes to privacy, you have to keep advocating really hard. I don't know her last name because it's Twitter, but Eva made a joke the other day that she doesn't like being referred to as a tireless privacy defender because she's like, I'm tired. I'm very tired. I would like a nap. And it's true, it does get really tiring because it can feel a little bit like you're kind of pounding your head against a wall that just keeps on creeping closer to you. And there's only so much you can do, but it is valuable. And I think it's important to keep in mind that advocacy is what keeps what protections we have in place. And it's what pushes for regulations and changes in privacy. And it's what helps protect people and their information. And I think keeping the perspective of this isn't just for me because I'm uncomfortable with Alexa listening to me or whatever. Right. It's for people that are in more vulnerable population groups. It's for kids that are developing a sense of self and need to be able to do that safely. And it's for, LGBTQ and non-binary and trans youth who would face actual danger if privacy keeps getting reduced. And people in refugee communities and in, activists that get tracked. It's thinking of privacy as something that you fight for, not just for yourself, I think really keeps things moving forward and keeps the importance of it to the forefront of your mind. I think it's easy to get hung up in the like, well, what do? I just do paperwork all day, every day. I write privacy policies nobody ever reads, and I do a bunch of contract renegotiation and reread laws that no one cares about, but it does matter and it does make a difference. And I think keeping that in the forefront of your mind really improves things for the future and provides motivation for us to keep going. So that's really my biggest takeaway.
That's a beautiful takeaway. I think privacy as advocacy and thinking of it, in the biggest, most interconnected sense is a beautiful way to close this out. So, Calli, Schroeder, thank you so much for joining us for the Tech Humanist Show. Thanks to everyone who watched live and offered comments and questions, and thanks to all the listeners out there. Please go ahead and subscribe, comment, like wherever you see this, and please tell your friends about it. Thanks again, Calli, and we'll see you next time.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.